Awesome. So welcome everyone. We are super excited to have you all here today. And we are going to hear from Emily about her research. And in case any of you haven't been to a Scientist to Go before, what we'll do is listen to her talk about what she studies and give you some insight on what her research is like. And then there'll be time at the end so you can ask any questions that you have. So if something comes up during the presentation, you can send it to me in the chat as we go, or we'll have lots of time at the end. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Emily. We're super excited to have you here, and thank you for joining us today.
Hi, everybody. I'm super excited to be here and see all of you, and I'm going to share my presentation with you real quick. All right, can everybody see that okay? All right, so my name is Emily Fusco, and I am a postdoctoral researcher at UMass Amherst. So I'm just a little bit south of you all here in Maine. So I wanted to start with talking a little bit about how I became a postdoctoral researcher, and also what is that anyway, because I definitely did not know what a postdoctoral researcher, or as we sometimes say postdoc, was when I was in middle school. So I wanted to share with you all kind of what that is. So I'm going to start a little bit farther back. So back in the day, I was in high school down in North Carolina. So this is just a picture of the high school that I went to. Some of you all may be looking forward to going to high school in a few years. And then after that, I went to college. So I went to college also in Wilmington, North Carolina. And so this is just a picture of my college campus, very pretty place. And so in college, I started really thinking about what I might want to do for a living. And I had to take a bunch of classes to get a general idea about the things that I might want to study. And one of the classes that I took was cell biology. And when I took this cell biology class, I decided that I did not like biology at all, and I was not going to be a scientist, and that I would probably do better in some other field where I didn't have to think about these tiny little cells and these things that I couldn't see and didn't really understand and was just not very interested in. And so I got through college on this track for environmental studies. So I was really interested in the outdoors, but the way that the university worked, if I wanted to avoid all those science classes that I thought that I didn't want to take, I could take a bunch of classes in this field of management and policy and laws. And I learned a lot about how we work on the environment through laws and policy and government, and a lot of the history of how we manage natural resources. And so after college, I took some time off to think more about what I wanted to do. And during that time, I worked as an AmeriCorps in Maryland. So it's like a volunteer type program, and I worked with the Park Service there and learned a lot about some of the conservation work that they were doing in Maryland. I also spent some time in Alberta, Canada, working as a field technician catching Western tiger salamanders. So this is me here in Alberta, and I'm trying to catch one of these guys here, which is a Western tiger salamander. They're pretty big. They're bigger than any of the salamanders that we have here in the Northeast. And so I thought a lot about what I wanted to do at this time, and I met a lot of other graduate students. So I got some ideas about maybe that I should go to graduate school. And so after a couple of years after college, I decided that I would go to graduate school. And that's when I moved to Massachusetts. And during graduate school is when I really learned that there's all sorts of different ways to be a scientist, that I don't have to study cells, and that I can actually be a scientist that studies things on a really big scale. And so I think about science in terms of what's happening in the whole United States. What kind of patterns are there, and how do they link to the different plants, or how people are interacting with the environment in different parts of the United States. And so I don't really ever have to think about cells anymore, and I can still do really cool science where I think on these really large spatial scales. So after graduate school, I became a postdoctoral researcher. And so all that means is it's the step in between being a graduate PhD student and before you get a permanent research job. So it's just a time to learn more skills and kind of be a little bit more independent as a researcher. And so I'm still studying a lot of the same things now, but it's kind of just this in-between step before I get, hopefully at some point, a permanent research job. But we don't know yet what that will be. So I'm on this stepping stone right now. So my research specifically has to do with invasive plants and wildfire. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about invasive plants, and then we'll talk some more about wildfire and how these two things are actually very connected. All right, so I don't know if many of you know what an invasive species is. I can see some of you. Can you raise your hand if you've heard of invasive species before? That's a good few of you. All right, I'm impressed. Yeah, so I don't know that I had a really good idea about what invasive species were before I started graduate school, but now I've learned a ton about them over the last 7 or 8 years, and so I can tell you some of the basic things about an invasive species in case you need a refresher. So the first thing is that it's non-native, and usually what we mean by that is that it's not on or originally from this continent. So if it's something that's maybe not from North America or the United States. The next really important thing to be an invasive is that it can survive without help from people. And so it doesn't count just if you have a plant in your garden, but it needs a lot of help from you every year to live, or if you have a plant in your house, that's not an invasive yet. So the next thing is that it also has to be spreading. So if the species stays in one place, it's not invasive. We usually call that just a naturalized species. And then the other really important thing when we're talking about invasive species is that they have some kind of negative impact. So there's something about it that we don't like or the ecosystem does not like, and so it's having some kind of negative impact on that ecosystem or on economy or on human health, are kind of the general areas that we look at. And so I want to go, so you might be wondering, how do invasive species even get here then? Because that's that first thing, it's not from this continent. And the basic answer is that people bring them. So there's all sorts of ways that people move invasive species around. And so if you see these goldfish here, so they might come through in the pet trade. So sometimes people get a pet and then they decide they don't want it anymore and they let it go. And that can be a really big problem if the species becomes established and starts spreading in that environment. Another thing is some of this more accidental moving around. So maybe there's weeds stuck on somebody's boat and they move it into a new lake. That weed might move with the boat. Or sometimes seeds can just be hitchhikers on people's boots and they can get spread around that way. Another main way that we get some invasive plants is through the ornamental plant trade. So this is back to this idea of gardens. So we import new plant species from all over the world all the time, just because we like them and we think that we might like to have them in our garden. And the vast majority of these species don't end up causing any problems. Sometimes because they need a lot of help from people to survive, or maybe, for example, it's a tropical species and in Maine during the winter, it would die if you leave it outside, so we don't really have to worry about it doing anything that will cause a problem. But sometimes species come through this way that actually really like it here, and they can establish and spread and be really competitive in their new environment. And then along with these ornamental species, we also sometimes have hitchhikers, like this bug here. So when we bring in plants from a new place, sometimes there are little insects that might be living on the plant and it just gets shipped over here and then they get introduced to the new environment. So that's another accidental way that we're introducing some species, but we're still bringing it in through this intentional pathway of bringing in these ornamental plants. And so you might be wondering what this photo is in the background here. So this is an invasive plant. It's called burning bush. And it is native So it's originally from over here in like China, Asia, Japan, and it was introduced into the United States as an ornamental plant. So this time of year, it's actually really pretty. It's got really bright red leaves, and people love having it in their gardens. But this plant causes so many problems for the native species because it's so competitive here. And what it does is it grows in really dense thickets. And it also escapes outside of gardens and yards, and it will become too competitive for native plants to grow. And so if you look here on this map of the US, these are all the states now that have invasive burning bush populations. And this plant is such a big problem that it's actually illegal now, at least in Massachusetts, to sell it. That's one of the ways that we kind of try to deal with these species once they get here. All right, you might recognize this species. So this is an American bullfrog. And it's actually native to the eastern United States, but it's invasive all over the rest of the world. All right, so this is just to remind you that it's not just the US that gets invasive species, we also give them to other countries. And so the reason why bullfrog was spread all over the world was a lot of things. It was introduced for pet trade, for example. It was also introduced as a food source. Maybe people wanted to eat frog legs in different places. And once these frogs get out, they're really competitive. If you've ever seen a bullfrog, they're really big, so they can eat a lot of other critters that they might find in a natural pond. And so that can be a really big problem for these species that live in Africa or South America or Europe or Asia, where they aren't used to having a big frog there. And now this frog will eat a lot of the native species and cause problems like that. All right, and so this is just another example of an invasive species. And this is an invasive species that I actually study a bit more closely. So this one is called bufflegrass. All right, so it's native mostly in Africa and in some parts of Asia. And it was introduced in the 1800s to the southwest of the United States. And these are all the states now where bufflegrass is invasive. And I want you to think about some of the pathways that we talked about, because this is one we haven't talked about yet. But there's a really interesting reason why bufflegrass is introduced to the Southwest. It was introduced as food for cows, so they could plant it in all these places that didn't have a lot of good grass, and now we could use that land for grazing. But the problem is that bufflegrass is a really tough species. It grows really competitively. It grows in these systems that aren't used to having any grass at all, really. And so that can be a problem for some of the native plants there. And this brings me to also how it's a problem for wildfire. So we go back to this idea of these invasive species have negative impacts. And one of the negative impacts of bufflegrass is that it can make fire more likely in an ecosystem that shouldn't have fire in it. All right, so how many of you have ever started at like a campfire before? All right, so when you start a campfire, do you start with the biggest logs first? No, right? You start with kindling. All right, so basically what the bufflegrass does is it acts like kindling. And so when there's some kind of ignition source here, so if you see the people introduce the invasive grass here at the top, right? And this is an example of our cows, and here's the bufflegrass. What it does is it introduces this kindling into an ecosystem that shouldn't normally have it. And so it changes the way that we talk about fuel in that ecosystem. So maybe there's no fuel there, everything there is really big. And so what happens is when we add this kindling and then people add a new ignition source, like maybe they threw their cigarette butt out of their car window, what happens is that there's actually something there now to catch fire. So if you threw, a match at a big log, it's not going to catch it on fire. But if you throw it into a pile of dry grass, that's going to start a fire. And so what happens is we then have a fire in this buffalo grass, which actually burns really hot and really fast compared to the stuff in these deserts where there's normally no grass. And that kills a lot of the native species there because they don't know how to deal with fire. And when it kills all the native species, the other, difficult part of this is that buffalo grass actually really likes fire. And so once it burns through, the buffalo grass will come back really quickly and more competitively. And you end up with even more buffalo grass. And then you end up in this cycle where you get more grass and more fire and less of your native species that you wanted. And so this is something that I actually study really closely, and this is called a grass fire cycle. And buffalo grass is just one example, but there's quite a few grass species in the United States that are causing this problem in different places. And so here is me in Arizona looking for buffalo grass. What we're doing here is field work, and what we're doing in this process specifically is putting down plots, and we're trying to measure how much buffalo grass is in this plot, and then also what that's doing to the native species. So we did a species survey and recorded all the species in the plot. And one thing that we're trying to figure out is whether if there's more buffalo grass, there's fewer native species. And so that's a project that we're working on right now. So I study invasive plants like buffalo grass by measuring them in the field like you just saw, and then also using data from citizen scientists. And so one of the things that I use a lot is data that other people have already collected, whether they're other scientists or just members of the public. So people like you all or your families, you might go out and see an invasive species, and then there are ways that you can share that data with scientists online. And so I use a lot of data from these databases to try to figure out just where these invasive plants are. It might sound silly, but a lot of times we don't really even know exactly where all the invasive plants are. And so these are the two main ways that I study invasive plants. And so I want you to think for a minute about how I might study fire. So I can tell you that I don't go out and measure fire in the field because that's very dangerous. And I'm not a firefighter, so I don't know how to be around fire in a safe way if there is a wildfire. But there's actually a really interesting way that we can study fire, and that's using satellites. So I did not really think much about satellites and the Earth and how satellites are always taking photos of the Earth until I was in graduate school. When I learned that NASA has all of these satellites that are constantly orbiting Earth, and they're always taking pictures of Earth's surface. And then these really brilliant computer scientists, remote sensing satellite folks are able to then interpret these images to give us more information about what's happening on Earth's surface. And so there are a couple of satellites on here. So this one down here, Landsat 7. There's a Landsat 8 now that's also up there. Terra and Aqua, these two satellites. These are all satellites that are focused on and also focused on fire, among other things. So they're constantly taking pictures of the Earth's surface, and that data is getting transferred into fire data. And that's something that someone like me can use to study how fire works on Earth. And so this is an example of what a fire might look like to a satellite. And so this is coming from the Aqua and Terra satellites that I just showed you. And what it's doing is it's looking for changes in heat on Earth's surface. And that's what's looking at, so this active fire infrared signature. So it's looking for these heat signals on Earth's surface where something just became much hotter than it was supposed to. And we can interpret that as a fire. And so this is from a fire that happened a couple of years ago in California, and you might have heard about it. So it was the Paradise Fire, and it was really destructive and caused a lot of problems. And so it's really important that we're able to get good data on this fire so we can understand what it was doing on Earth's surface. And so yeah, using these satellites is one way to study that. But I also want you to remember that some fires are good. So the one that I just talked about, the Paradise Fire, that was a dangerous fire. It moved really fast and it burned down, a whole town. But there are a lot of ways that fire is good and important. And so some of the things that good fire can do is release nutrients into the soil. It also helps some plants release their seeds. So there are some species of pine trees, for example, that the cones are stuck shut until they get hot enough. And there needs to be a fire to get the cones hot enough. And once they're hot enough, they can pop open and release all their seeds. So they're really important for these trees. They also are really important for creating habitat for different animals. And so it's important to remember that there are good and bad fires. And fires are only really bad when they're burning in a way that is outside of what would be normal for that ecosystem. And so some ecosystems have fire every few years, and that's really important for them. Some ecosystems have, really cool fires. Some ecosystems have hot fires. And so it's most important that the fire burns in a way that that ecosystem is used to. And so one example of that here is this pine ecosystem. And so this is a good fire going through a pine ecosystem. And one of the really important things about fire and pine ecosystems is that if they don't burn relatively frequently, maybe every 5 or 10 years, what happens is a lot of different tree species might start to survive there. So one example is oak trees are really competitive in these kind of ecosystems. And so if there are not fires to burn other plants like oak trees or different shrubs, then eventually, if there's no fire at all, these trees get really competitive and outcompete the pine trees, and we won't have any pine trees left. And so these ecosystems evolved to burn pretty frequently, and that keeps them healthy. And so you may be wondering, what are some things that you can do to help in this world of fires and invasive plants? And the biggest thing you can do for fires to make sure that we have good fires and not bad fires is to not start fires. And so this just goes back to this, if you've heard of Smokey Bear, this idea to make sure your campfire is out. Don't leave fires burning in the woods. If your town has what we call a red flag warning, meaning that there's a lot of fire weather because it's really dry and hot and windy, that you don't have a fire outside in your yard, so you follow all those rules, and that way we don't have fires when we're not supposed to have fires. So that's the biggest thing that you can do in this world of fire. And then with invasive plants, there are a few things you can do. And so one is, if you have invasive plants in your yard, you can pull them out. And so you can make room for native species in your yard by removing invasive plants. You can also plant native species in your gardens. And so when you go, maybe if you ever go with your parents to the garden store or help them pick out flowers for the garden, you can try to make sure that these are plants that already occur in the area where you live. And one really great benefit to that is that native plants actually will help bring more birds and butterflies to your garden because they like the native species better. So if you like birds and butterflies, then you're gonna have a lot more to see if you have a garden full of native plants. And then the other thing that you can do is, depending on where you are and what kind of information like your local officials are looking for, there are ways to report invasive species. So one of the best ways that we can make sure that invasive species don't cause a problem is to find them when there still aren't that many and get rid of them fast, because once they spread really far, it's hard to get rid of them. And so one example of this is the spotted lanternfly. So this is a new invasive, and it's one that was just sighted for the first time in Massachusetts out on the Cape a few weeks ago. It's new, it's mostly over in Pennsylvania right now, but they suspect that this insect is gonna start moving up the East Coast and kind of out this way. So I don't know yet if it's gonna be headed up to Maine quite yet, but this is just an example of some campaigns that we use to try to get the public to help us find these invasive species before they cause a problem. And so these kinds of instructions, like taking a specimen or taking a photo, to make sure that you're identifying the species correctly and then telling the correct people so that they can come take care of it before it gets out of control. All right, that is all I have for you today. So I'm happy to answer any questions, and I'm going to stop my screen share now.
Awesome. So if anyone has any questions, you can send those to me in the chat. We've already got some that came in while you were talking. And I think we can just kind of start in chronological order. But we have a student wondering about bullfrogs a little bit more. And they're wondering, where are bullfrogs invasive? Do you know any countries specifically, or is it just kind of everywhere?
Yeah, there are some specific countries. So one thing that I didn't get into is that they're native in the eastern part of the United States, but not in the western part. But they are there now. So in places like California, they're considered invasive. But they're also invasive in, I think, most countries of South America. They are definitely invasive in China. They're invasive, I believe, in Niger in Africa. They are also invasive in quite a few of the European countries. I can't remember all of them, but it is a lot of them.
Awesome. Well, not awesome that they're everywhere, but
awesome for the bullfrogs.
Yeah. Then we have a lot of different students wondering, what should they do if they find an invasive species? If it's an insect, should they squish it? If it's a plant and they pull it out of the ground, then what should they do with it?
That is a good question. So if you find an invasive insect, but it's already an invasive insect that's really widespread where you are, squishing one probably is not going to help a lot. And so if you're like me, I always feel bad killing bugs because it's not their fault they're invasive. You don't have to kill every invasive bug that you see. If you have invasive plants in your yard and you want to get rid of them, this can be a little more effective because you can actually like stay on top of it and pull them out as they come up. And usually what you have to do to get rid of them, it depends on the plant. So some plants you can just like throw away with yard waste, some you can't. So it really depends on the plant. And so usually what we do is pull them out and let them dry out in the yard and then get rid of them after that. But you probably want to check on which plant it is first.
Awesome. Then we have some more students wondering, who do you report to if you find an invasive thing? Is it the same for every species, or is it different for each one?
It depends on the species. So different organizations might be looking for different species or might be in charge of different species. And so what you want to do is see if there's anything that they're interested in particular in Maine around where you are. So that might be looking with like the USDA Forest Service would be one big organization that might be very interested. Some of the state organizations, so whatever the Maine equivalent of like a Department of Environmental Conservation, they might be the group that's interested. And so it's really on a species by species basis. And I can try to look up, see if there's anything you all should be on the lookout for in Maine and send something your way.
Awesome. Then we have some students wondering, are there any invasive birds that you know of?
Yes, there are definitely invasive birds. So in the United States, one of the big common invasive birds that we have is the European starling. So have you all seen starlings? Maybe. So they're kind of a medium-sized black bird with a lot of like white dots on them. And they fly around in really, really big groups. And so they're a problem because they're a really competitive bird and they make it harder for native birds to live here just because there are so many. And the interesting thing about starlings is that they were actually introduced by, when was this? In like the 17 or 1800s maybe, by a group of Shakespeare enthusiasts. And so what they wanted to do was to get all of the species that Shakespeare talked about in his works from Europe into the United States. And so they introduced them here on purpose as part of this way to make the United States more like Europe. And that turned into a big problem.
Wow, that is an interesting piece of information that I didn't know. That's pretty cool. We also have some students wondering, are farm animals considered to be invasive or no because they're taken care of by farmers?
That's a good question. In most cases, farm animals wouldn't really be considered invasive because they aren't going to get out and be on their own and become like in these large groups. But we do talk about, so one example is feral hogs. So these are a problem in the southeastern United States. And so these are pigs that when they get out, they kind of revert from like a normal cute farm pig back into a really like wild pig. And these wild pigs are definitely considered invasive in the Southeast. What they do is they can be really destructive. They dig up the soil in the forest, rooting around looking for things to eat. And so there are cases where farm animals can become invasive, but when we think about our normal like farm cows and normal farm pigs, like no, those are not usually, those wouldn't be considered invasive.
Awesome. Then we have some questions more from the beginning of your talk, and we have a class wondering, what is cell biology and why did you not like it?
So cell biology is a way, it's just one area of biology that normally they start you off learning because it's important to learn about things at the smallest level. So cell biology is learning about how all plants and animals are made up of cells, and it's learning about what all of those cells do and how all the pieces of those cells work together to create life. But I personally didn't really like it because cells are so small, it's really hard to see them. And if I can't see something, I am not usually that excited about learning about it. So I like thinking about whole plants or places or ecosystems because I can relate to them more. But thinking about these tiny little cells, even though they're really important and you have to learn about them, just wasn't exciting for me. I thought it was kind of boring. So yeah, that's why I didn't like cell biology. But a lot of people love it. And I'm so glad that other people love it because that means that I don't have to do it. So hopefully we have some cell biologists out here, some future cell biologists.
Yeah, and that's definitely one of the parts of science that's really cool. Are there are lots of different areas you can go into. So if you don't like one piece of it, that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
We also have a student who wanted to share that in California, they know when there's a red flag warning, you can only have fires in sand pits on the beach, which is one way to help lower down some forest fires.
That's awesome.
And then we also have some students wondering, are there other ways to study fires than from satellites, or is that really the only way that you can do it?
So that's the only way that there are other ways to study fires. So there are some people that study fire kind of on a much smaller scale. So some things that they might do would be have, in a really fancy lab where they're able to light certain plants on fire, for example, and just measure how hot they burn. And so like that might be something that's really important for people studying wildfire to know how hot different plants can burn. You can also study fire by they do some plot studies where you go out and the scientists actually designate different areas to burn, and they burn them and see what happens to the plants that are already there, see what comes back. So that's another way to study fires. And then other people too will go out to places where there was a wildfire, and they might look at what happened where the wildfire was compared to outside of where the wildfire was, and get an idea of what was what that wildfire might have done in that area. So there's a ton of different ways to study it, but because I think about fires for the whole United States, the best way for me to do that is to get basically a map of all the fires in the United States, and that comes from satellites.
Awesome. Then we have a couple of different students who are wondering, what was the animal again that you studied when you were in Canada?
Oh, yeah. So that is a Western tiger salamander. And so they are, I guess, so here we have, you might have seen like a redback salamander. So it's kind of similar to that, except that these guys are much, much bigger. And where they live, they're one of the salamanders that occurs the farthest north, which is really cool, because a lot of amphibians don't like to be in really cold places. And what these salamanders do is they live a lot of their life underground, kind of in tunnels. And then in the spring, they come out and they swim around in these, what are called, so they're just wetlands up there. And they spend time swimming around in the wetlands so that they can lay eggs and eat food. And then they go back underground for most of the year. And when they're in the wetlands, they play a really important role because a lot of the wetlands there where these salamanders exist, they don't have fish. And so these salamanders are like the big bad predators of those wetlands once they're in them. So they play a really, really important role in those ecosystems.
Awesome. Then we have a student wondering, is making presentations like this part of your job, or is it something that you do for fun?
It's kind of both. So I think that it's really important to do these kinds of presentations and talk to different people. It's not required for my job. So it is something that I kind of do for fun, but it is still part of my job if I want it to be part of my job, which I do. So both.
Awesome. Then we have a class who's wondering, what makes a fire a wildfire versus just a normal fire?
Yeah, so there's all sorts of different ways that fires can burn. And so we have wildfires, which are fires that are burning kind of out of control in a place and at a time when we don't want them to be there. But there are other kinds of fires like prescribed fires. So these are good fires where fire researchers and fire, like prescribed fire specialist type people will go out and intentionally set a fire so that it can be a good fire in that ecosystem. And then there's any other kind of fire that's controlled. So if you have a campfire and it stays controlled, that's not a wildfire. So there's just all sorts of other ways that we can have fires on Earth, but these wildfires are any kind of fire that's not an intentional fire, it's not controlled, and it's not doing something good that we want it to do.
Awesome. Then we have some students wondering if you know anything about invasive sea animals.
Oh, invasive sea animals. I know a little bit about some invasive sea animals. So I know that one of the main ways that invasive sea animals are spread is through shipping. And so when they have these big ships that carry cargo from one country to another, one thing that they do is they fill up with ballast water, which is a bunch of water that goes into a part of the ship to help the ship maintain a good weight. And so what happens is the ship might suck up a bunch of water from where it started, and then it goes to where it's going to transport the materials. And when it gets to its destination, it releases all of the ballast water. And this is a problem because sometimes when it's sucking up water, it sucks up other critters and stuff in it. And so that's one way that like ocean animals can get moved around. And then I know that there's some invasive ocean critters. So I know like a lionfish is one that's a big problem, and I think that's more off like the Southeast Atlantic coast, but maybe they're moving northward. But I study mostly land systems. So I don't know as much about ocean systems.
Then we have a student who is really interested to know if you know of any invasive worms.
Oh, well, that's a really good question. So there is one invasive worm that everybody is very worried about right now, and I think it's called a jumping worm. And I know that these invasive worms, one of the things that they do that causes problems is that they move around in the soil and they make the soil kind of different than the native plants like it. And so that can help non-native plants do better. And actually, one interesting thing about worms is that in a lot of the northern part of the United States, there actually aren't any native worms, because the last time that we had a glaciation, so the last time there were all those glaciers in the United States, it got rid of a lot of the worms in the northern part of the country. And so pretty much all of the worms that you might find in the Northeast now aren't actually native to here. They're worms that might have gotten, one of the main things that happens is people take worms fishing, and then they like finish fishing and they still have worms left, so they just dump them out. So that's one of the main ways that we've gotten a lot of non-native and invasive worm populations.
Awesome. That's really interesting and not a question I would have thought to ask. So interesting to hear about. We have a student who's wondering, how long have you been a postdoctoral researcher for, and how long are people generally in that role?
That is a good question too. So that varies a lot. I have been a postdoc for almost 2 years now. And it really depends on, so how long you stay in that position depends on a lot of things. So a lot of people might work as a postdoc for 2 or 3 years for, one boss, and then they might go do another postdoc with another boss for another 2 or 3 years. It's becoming more common for people to go do a third postdoc for 2 or 3 years. And so anywhere from 0 to 6 years would be pretty normal at this point to be a postdoc, and I'm at year 2. And it really just depends on how long it takes to find a more permanent job.
Awesome. And then I think we have time for one more question here, and I think this is a good one to wrap up with. Students are wondering, what is your favorite part of your job?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that one of the coolest things about being a scientist is that when you're doing a new research project and you finally find an answer to a question that you've been wondering about for maybe a few years, you might have been working on finding an answer to a question. When you finally find that answer, I think it's so cool that for a little while before you report those results to all, and get them published and all that, you're the only person in the whole world that knows the answer to that question. And I think that is just one of the coolest things, that you get to learn something and know something before anybody else does, and then you get to share that with other people.
Awesome. Well, that is really, really cool. And we really appreciate you taking the time today to come and answer all of our questions and teach us all about invasive plants and wildfires and lots of really cool stuff. And I appreciate all of the students who've joined us today, and you had some really awesome questions, and I was really impressed with them. If we didn't get to your specific question, I'm sorry that we ran out of time, and hopefully we'll get to yours next time. But thank you everyone for joining us, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you all. It was great to talk with you today.
Bye everybody.